Is that black intruder still here? My father-in-law's hoarse voice cut through the festive air of the wedding like a sharp blade. He thought he was whispering to his cousin, but his words carried perfectly across the hall decorated with white and gold flowers. I was standing next to the cake table, adjusting the tie on my dark gray suit, when his words hit me. There was no surprise on my face. Just that controlled smile I had practiced in the mirror for weeks. My name is Omari Thompson, I am 34 years old, and this was not the first time Robert Whitman had called me an intruder in my own wife's family. The difference is that today, unlike the last 5 years of silent humiliation, I was completely prepared for what was to come. My sister-in-law Christina's wedding was taking place at the Whitman estate in Westchester County, New York. A stone mansion with gardens stretching over 3 acres, built with the pride of 4 generations of pure American blood, as Robert liked to say. The ceremony had been perfect: 200 guests, a live orchestra, and champagne that cost more than most people's monthly salary. My wife Jennifer was across the hall, chatting animatedly with her cousins about the bride's dress. She hadn't heard her father's comment, but I knew it wouldn't be the last of the night. Robert Whitman had a knack for turning any family celebration into a subtle display of racial hierarchy, always with that political smile that masked decades of ingrained prejudice. What he didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 months documenting every discriminatory comment, every joke about my background, every attempt to exclude me from important family decisions. Not out of paranoia, but because a corporate lawyer learns early on to always have evidence. Especially when that lawyer was about to become the owner of the house where the entire family was celebrating. As I watched Robert laugh with the older guests, probably sharing another one of his stories about how things were better in the past, I surreptitiously checked my phone. The message I had been waiting for had finally arrived: documents signed. Property transferred. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. 3 hours before the ceremony, while Robert was adjusting his tie in the master bedroom, I had finalized the purchase of his house through an investment company he would never suspect was connected to me. The same house that was mortgaged to the hilt due to his poor financial decisions in recent years. The irony was delicious. The man who spent Sunday dinners questioning whether I really deserved to be in his family was about to discover that his financial security now depended entirely on me. I put my phone away and walked calmly toward the bar, where Robert was pouring whiskey for my uncles. Every step calculated, every breath controlled. There was no rush. The night was just beginning, and I had until tomorrow morning to decide exactly how and when to reveal my new position as their landlord. If you're enjoying this story of reversal and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this racist family reacted when they discovered who was really in control. As I grabbed a glass of water at the bar, I smiled politely at Robert, who ignored me completely, as he always did. He had no idea he was drinking his last whiskey as the owner of that house. Robert Whitman was the kind of man who turned prejudice into subtle art. At 67, he had built a respectable political career as a Westchester councilman for 2 decades, always with a perfect speech about community unity and traditional American values. In city council chambers, he voted correctly on all civil rights issues. At home, it was a completely different story. The first time Jennifer took me to meet her family, 5 years ago, Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and that rehearsed political smile. "So you're the lawyer," he said, emphasizing the word as if it were a genuine surprise to meet a black man who graduated from Harvard. During that dinner, he asked pointed questions about my background, and whether I really graduated with honors, or had been helped by some special program. Jennifer, naive as ever about the nuances of racism, believed her father was just being protective. She didn't notice how he systematically questioned my every achievement, as if my professional success were some kind of anomaly that needed to be explained. In the years that followed, Robert perfected the art of family microaggression. At Sunday dinners, he would always mention crimes that people like me committed, based on news stories he saw on television. He would ask if I really understood family traditions when we discussed holidays. When Jennifer and I bought our house in Manhattan, he openly questioned how a young man of your age could afford such an expensive property, implying that I must be involved in something illegal. The worst were the family moments when he simply ignored me. During discussions about investments or politics, he directed all questions to other men in the family, even though he knew I was the only corporate lawyer in the room. When I offered my opinion, he would change the subject or make a comment about how outsiders sometimes don't understand how things really work. Jennifer tried to downplay these incidents. "He's from a different generation," she would say, as if age were an excuse for systematic racism. "He just needs time to get used to it." 5 years later, he had gotten perfectly used to it, used to treating me like a permanent intruder in my own wife's family. The moment that really opened my eyes happened 6 months ago, during the Whitmans' 40th wedding anniversary. I was helping organize the party when I overheard Robert talking to his brother on the porch. "Jennifer could have done better," he said, thinking I wasn't listening. A man from her own background. Someone who really understood our values. That night, I began documenting everything. Every discriminatory comment, every attempt to exclude me, every moment where he treated other sons-in-law with respect while giving me that look of disdain. Not out of paranoia, but because a real estate lawyer learns early on that documentation is power. And it was during this documentation that I discovered something interesting about the Whitmans' finances. The mansion where we were celebrating, the property Robert used to intimidate and impress, was in serious financial trouble. Through public records, I discovered that he had mortgaged the house 3 times in the last 2 years. His attempts to maintain the family's social status were literally bankrupting the property that was the symbol of his pride. Robert Whitman, the man who spent dinners questioning my financial ability, was just months away from losing everything. The irony was delicious. While he doubted my professional competence, his own financial decisions were destroying the family legacy he valued so much. But the most revealing discovery came when I investigated further. The investment company that was about to foreclose on the house belonged to a conglomerate of which I had become a minority partner the previous year. With the right connections and adequate capital, it would be possible to acquire the property directly. Imagine the irony, the man who called me an intruder losing his home to the very intruder he so despised. As I watched Robert laugh with his guests, telling anecdotes about his good old days in politics, I knew he had no idea how precarious his situation really was. Every laugh, every display of superiority, only amplified the satisfaction I would feel when reality finally caught up with him. The difference between us was simple. He underestimated people based on the color of their skin, while I evaluated opportunities based on facts and figures. And the numbers didn't lie. Robert Whitman was financially ruined, relying entirely on loans to maintain the illusion of prosperity. I put my phone away and walked calmly toward the table where Jennifer was talking with her cousins. It was time to begin the final phase of my plan, and it would all start with a seemingly innocent conversation about real estate in the area. The bride's father's speech was the moment when Robert Whitman showed his true colors to the entire family. He stood up, champagne in hand, and began with the traditional thanks to the guests. But when it came time to mention the groom's family, his words took a turn that made my blood run cold. "I want to especially thank the people who truly belong to this family," he said, emphasizing the word truly, as his gaze swept across the room, deliberately avoiding looking at me. "People who understand our values, our history, our tradition." He paused dramatically. "And of course those who strive to fit in, even though they come from different backgrounds." The awkward silence that followed was broken only by the clinking of champagne glasses. I felt Jennifer's gaze on me, but I kept my expression neutral. Some guests coughed nervously, others stared at their own shoes. Robert continued, each word carefully chosen to sound inclusive while doing exactly the opposite. "We know that not everyone has had the same opportunities that our family has had," he continued, his voice taking on that condescending tone I knew so well. "But we admire when people who work hard manage to reach our social level through, well, various means." It was at that moment that something inside me broke for good. It wasn't just the public humiliation. I had faced that before. It was the realization that he was doing this at his own daughter's wedding, using a moment that should have been one of celebration to belittle me in front of 200 people. And worst of all, Jennifer was laughing nervously, trying to pretend that this was just her father's quirky way. When the speech was over and people returned to their conversations, Jennifer approached me with that forced smile I knew so well. "Dad sometimes goes a little overboard," she whispered, touching my arm. "You know he didn't mean anything by it." "Of course he did," I replied calmly, and saw the shock in her eyes. It was the first time in 5 years that I hadn't minimized or excused her father's behavior. "Jennifer, your father just publicly humiliated me at your sister's wedding. And you're asking me to pretend it didn't happen." "Omari, please, let's not make a scene here," she replied, looking around nervously. "It's Christina's wedding. We can talk about this at home." But I didn't want to talk about it at home anymore. I didn't want to be the understanding husband who silently swallowed insults to keep the peace in the family. At that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop being invisible for convenience and start being invisible for strategy. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, where I called my partner Marcus Chen. Marcus was one of the most brilliant lawyers I knew, specializing in hostile takeovers and financial restructuring. More importantly, he had no patience for racism disguised as family tradition. "Marcus, I need to speed up that project we discussed," I said quietly, making sure I was alone. "The Whitman property. I need it finalized before the end of the month." "Omari, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no turning back. And considering your family situation." "Especially because of my family situation," I interrupted. "He wants to treat me like an intruder? Then I'll show him what an intruder can really do." Marcus was silent for a moment. "All right. I'll expedite the process. But Omari, be sure you're prepared for the consequences. This will change everything." When I returned to the ballroom, everything seemed normal on the surface. People danced, talked, celebrated. But to me, every laugh, every toast, every moment of happiness was happening in the house I would be owning in a matter of weeks. Robert Whitman, the man who had just publicly questioned my place in the family, was about to find out that I not only belonged, I was in charge. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of irony. I helped clear the dishes, put away the extra chairs, and even offered rides to some of the older relatives. Each act of kindness was genuine, but now it had an additional layer of meaning. I wasn't being the submissive son-in-law, I was being the future owner taking care of his property. Jennifer noticed my change in mood during the drive home. "Are you okay? You've been acting strange since Dad's speech." "Actually, I'm great," I replied honestly. "Better than I've been in a long time." "Omari, I know Dad can be difficult, but he's getting better. Remember how he was when we first started dating?" I laughed, but it wasn't a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had finally stopped waiting for people to change and decided to change the situation. "Jennifer, your father isn't getting better. He's just getting more sophisticated in his prejudice. But don't worry, the situation will resolve itself very soon." She looked at me with a confused expression, but didn't press the issue. She probably thought I was just venting after a difficult day. She had no idea that I had just set in motion a plan that would reveal exactly who had the real power in that family. That night, while Jennifer slept, I stayed up reviewing the documents Marcus had emailed me. The Whitman property, valued at $2.3 million, would be mine for $1.1 million due to Robert's financial problems. More important than the money was the symbolism. The man who questioned my place in the family was about to discover that his own place depended entirely on me. But I didn't just want to buy the house. I wanted to do it in a way that would maximize the lesson Robert needed to learn. So I decided not to reveal my identity as the buyer until the perfect moment. He was going to find out who his new landlord was in the most dramatic way possible. I closed my laptop and smiled in the dark. Robert Whitman had spent 5 years teaching me that I didn't belong in his family. Now I was going to teach him what it really meant to belong nowhere. And the best part? He still had no idea that the real game had just begun. 3 days after the wedding, Marcus Chen called me with news that exceeded my wildest expectations. "Omari, you need to see the documents we got on the Whitmans' financial situation. It's much worse than we imagined." We were sitting in his office in downtown Manhattan, overlooking Central Park. Marcus had spread a stack of documents across the polished mahogany desk, each paper revealing a new layer of Robert Whitman's financial incompetence. "The mansion isn't just their primary asset," Marcus explained, pointing to a detailed spreadsheet. "It's literally all they have left. Robert has liquidated the family's investments over the past 2 years to cover credit card debt and personal loans. They are living exclusively on revolving credit." I examined the numbers with the same meticulousness I applied to the most complex corporate contracts. The situation was even more dramatic than I had anticipated. Robert Whitman, the man who questioned my financial acumen at every family dinner, was less than 60 days away from losing everything. "But here's the interesting part," Marcus continued, pulling out another document. "The investment company that will foreclose on the mortgage has a history of selling foreclosed properties to private investors before they even go to public auction. It's perfectly legal, but it allows for discreet acquisitions." "Discreet how?" "Discreet enough that Robert will never know who actually bought his house until it's too late to do anything about it." The beauty of the plan lay in its legal simplicity. I wasn't doing anything questionable or vindictive in a destructive sense. I was simply taking advantage of a legitimate investment opportunity that had arisen due to someone else's poor financial decisions. The fact that that someone was my racist father-in-law was just a delightful coincidence. How much time do we have? I asked, already mentally organizing the next steps. The formal execution is in 3 weeks. If you want to proceed, I need your authorization today to prepare the documentation. But Omari, once we do this, there's no discreet way to back out. He'll find out eventually. Marcus, let me ask you something. In your professional opinion, does a man who spends 5 years systematically humiliating his son-in-law based on racial prejudice deserve to have his financial security questioned when his own irresponsible choices put him at risk? Marcus smiled for the first time in the meeting. Professionally, I would say that financial decisions have natural consequences regardless of the moral character of the person making them. Personally, I would say that some men need to learn humility in the most effective way possible. Then we have a deal. While Marcus prepared the documents, my mind was already working on the most delicate phase of the plan: how and when to reveal to Robert that his new landlord was the black intruder he so despised. The timing would be crucial. Revealing it too early would lose its impact. Revealing it too late would lose the educational lesson. That evening, Jennifer noticed my improved mood during dinner. "You seem different since Christina's wedding," she commented, pouring wine. "More confident, I would say." "Maybe I'm finally feeling more comfortable with my place in this family," I replied, and technically I wasn't lying. Soon, I would literally be positioned at the top of the family hierarchy, at least in terms of real estate ownership. "Dad mentioned he wants to talk to you soon," she added casually. "Something about plans for the holidays at the house." The irony was so perfect that I almost laughed out loud. Robert wanted to discuss future events in a house that I would be owning before the fall leaves had finished falling. "Sure," I replied calmly. "I look forward to hearing his plans." 2 days later, Marcus called with an unexpected complication. "Omari, we have a problem. The investment company wants to inspect the property before finalizing the purchase. It's standard procedure, but it means someone will need access to the house. And the problem is, Robert has to authorize access. He'll know someone is interested in buying the foreclosed property. It could raise suspicions." It was exactly the kind of obstacle I had anticipated. "Marcus, let me handle this. I have an idea." That afternoon, I called Robert directly. For the first time in 5 years, I initiated a conversation with my father-in-law. "Robert, it's Omari. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Omari." His voice carried that slightly unpleasant surprise as always. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, I'm calling to offer help. Jennifer mentioned that you are experiencing some temporary financial challenges. As a corporate lawyer, I often work with debt restructuring solutions. Perhaps I could review your situation and suggest some options." The silence on the other end of the line was long and revealing. Robert Whitman, the man who never missed an opportunity to question my professional competence, was being forced to consider my financial assistance. "That's unexpected," he finally replied. "I didn't know you had experience with this type of situation." "I have more experience than you might think, Robert. I can stop by the house tomorrow to review the documents, if you'd like." It was perfect. I would go to the house as a helpful son-in-law offering free legal assistance. Any additional inspection would be easily explained as part of my assessment of their financial situation. "Well, if you think you can help." He hesitated, clearly struggling between pride and financial desperation. "Of course I can help, Robert. After all, we're family." When I hung up the phone, I smiled at the irony of the situation. In 24 hours, I would be at the Whitmans' house as a guest, offering advice on how they could avoid losing the property I was already buying. If you've been following this journey of strategic patience and are eager to see how justice unfolds, subscribe to the channel, because the next phase will reveal exactly how a perfect plan executes when you least expect it. The difference between revenge and justice, I was learning, was mainly a matter of method and timing. And both were aligning perfectly. The meeting at the Whitman mansion was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Thursday. Robert had prepared a folder with all the family's financial documents, clearly expecting me to offer some kind of family loan or debt restructuring. What he didn't know was that I would arrive as the new legal owner of the house where he had lived for 30 years. Marcus Chen accompanied me, introduced as my partner in complex real estate matters. Jennifer was present, still believing that I was genuinely trying to help the family. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. While Robert nervously organized the papers on the dining room table, I was mentally cataloging every piece of furniture and artwork that now belonged to me. "Omari, thank you so much for offering to review our situation," Robert began, his tone clearly strained. It was the first time in 5 years he had thanked me for anything. "As you can see from the documents, we have some temporary cash flow challenges, but nothing that can't be resolved with proper planning." I examined the papers calmly, pretending to analyze numbers I already knew by heart. The hypocrisy of the situation was fascinating. The man who questioned my financial competence at every Sunday dinner now depended on that same competence to save his home. "Robert, can I be blunt with you?" I asked, setting the documents aside. "The situation is much more serious than you are admitting. Based on these numbers, you have about 3 weeks before foreclosure." The silence that followed was tense. Jennifer looked between us, clearly concerned, while Robert tried to maintain his political composure. "Well, that's why we're here," he replied, forcing a smile. "We were hoping you could suggest some financing options or perhaps a restructuring through your corporate contacts." It was at that moment that Marcus opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. "Actually, Mr. Whitman, we do have an interesting situation to discuss." Robert frowned but accepted the envelope. As he opened it, I kept my expression completely neutral, watching his eyes scan the official property transfer document. The color drained completely from his face. His hands began to shake slightly as he reread the document a second time, as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. I don't understand," he muttered. "This document says the property was sold yesterday to—" His eyes moved to the buyer's name and then fixed on me with a look of growing horror. "Omari Thompson," I finished calmly. "Yes, Robert. I bought your house." The silence that followed was absolute. Jennifer stared at me in shock, Marcus watched the situation with professional interest, and Robert seemed to have stopped breathing completely. That's impossible," he finally managed to articulate. "You can't. How did you get?" "How did I get what, Robert? Money?" My voice remained calm, but there was a new firmness to it. "The same way I get everything in life, by working hard, being competent, and making smart financial decisions. Qualities you've always questioned whether I truly possessed." Robert tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Jennifer, did you know about this?" My wife shook her head, still processing the information. "Omari, what's going on here?" "What's going on," I replied, finally allowing myself a slight smile, "is that your father is learning that actions have consequences. 5 years of comments about me being an intruder, 5 years of questioning my ability, 5 years of treating me as if I didn't deserve to be in this family." "But how did you have the money to?" Robert was clearly struggling to understand how the son-in-law he had always underestimated had the resources to buy a $2.3 million property. "Robert, you never bothered to really get to know who I am," I replied, getting up and walking over to the window overlooking the gardens. "You saw the color of my skin and assumed I was inferior financially, intellectually, socially. You never asked about my family, my investments, my career before you met Jennifer." I turned to face him directly. "My investment portfolio is worth $8.7 million. I'm a minority partner in 4 technology companies. My family owns commercial properties in 3 states. I could have bought your house 5 times over with last year's dividends alone." The revelation hit Robert like a punch in the stomach. His entire belief system about racial superiority was crumbling in the face of concrete numbers he couldn't question. "Then why?" Jennifer began to ask. "Why didn't I say anything before?" I finished the question. "Because I wanted to see if this family would accept me for who I am, not for my money. And the answer was crystal clear. You never saw me as an equal, regardless of how much I had in the bank." Marcus closed his briefcase with a final click. "Mr. Whitman, legally you have 30 days to vacate the property. But my client is willing to negotiate a rental agreement if you're interested." Robert looked at me with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something that almost resembled respect. You planned all this." "No, Robert. You planned all this. My voice was firm but not cruel. Every discriminatory comment, every attempt to belittle me, every joke about my background. You created the circumstances that made this purchase not only possible, but necessary. The irony of the situation finally dawned on him. The man who had spent years calling me an intruder was about to discover what it really meant to have no place to call home. And as he processed his new reality, I knew that the real lesson was just beginning. The 2 hours that followed my revelation were the most tense of my adult life. Robert Whitman remained seated in that chair as if he had been physically struck, alternating between looking at the property documents and looking at me with an expression that mixed shock, anger, and something I had never seen in his eyes before, forced respect. Jennifer had left the room 3 times to get some air, clearly struggling to process that her husband had secretly purchased her family's home. Marcus remained professional, but I could see in his eyes the satisfaction of witnessing justice being served in real time. Omari, Robert finally managed to articulate, his voice hoarse and unlike the authoritative tone I had known 5 years ago. I need to understand a few things. Ask whatever you want, Robert. For the first time in 5 years, I'm going to be completely honest with you. He swallowed hard, his hands still trembling slightly. Where did you get that kind of money? I mean, you work at a law firm. I'm a senior partner at Phillips, Chen & Associates, I replied calmly. One of the most respected corporate law firms in Manhattan. My specialty is corporate debt restructuring and acquisitions of financially distressed properties. Exactly the kind of work that makes situations like yours extremely lucrative. The irony was not lost on either of us. The man who questioned my professional competence had literally become a case study of my work. But your clothes, your car, the way you, Robert gestured vaguely, trying to reconcile his prejudiced perceptions with reality. What did you expect, Robert? Gold chains and a Lamborghini. My voice carried 5 years of pent-up frustration. You saw a black man and assumed that any success I had would be loud, ostentatious, probably illegal. It never occurred to you that I might simply be good at what I do and prefer discretion. Jennifer returned to the room at that moment, her eyes red from crying. Omari, we need to talk. Alone. Marcus, taking the cue, began gathering his documents. Mr. Whitman, my client would like to discuss the terms of the lease agreement. You have a week to decide whether you want to remain on the property as a tenant or if you'd rather find another place. Robert just nodded, clearly still processing the complete reversal of his situation. The man who had always seen himself as my superior now depended on my generosity to keep a roof over his head. When we were alone, Jennifer stared at me with a mixture of admiration and betrayal in her eyes. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I wanted to see if your family would accept me for who I am, not for what I have, I replied honestly. And the answer was crystal clear. 5 years, Jennifer. 5 years of comments, of insinuations, of being treated like an unwanted visitor in my own family. But you could have stopped this at any time, she said, her voice mixing confusion and anger. You could have shown that you had money, that you were successful. Dad would have respected you. Exactly. My answer took her by surprise. Your father would only respect me if I had money. Not for my education, not for my character, not because I love you and treat you well. Just for money. That's not respect, Jennifer. It's fear. She was silent for a long moment, processing the truth of my words. What now? What happens to us? It was the question I had avoided thinking about during weeks of planning. That's up to you, Jennifer. You can continue to be married to the man I've always been, or you can discover that you can't look at me the same way knowing that I have resources your father doesn't. Over the next 3 months, our home became a silent battleground. Jennifer struggled to reconcile the husband she thought she knew with the reality of who I truly was. Some nights, she looked at me with pride as we discussed my investments. Other nights, I caught her staring at me as if I were a stranger. Robert, for his part, underwent a transformation that was both gratifying and unsettling to watch. The rental agreement I offered was generous, significantly below market value, allowing him to maintain his basic dignity while learning to live within his actual means. But the most dramatic change was in how he interacted with me. At our Sunday dinners, which continued for some time, he began asking me genuine questions about investments, the real estate market, and financial strategies. Not as someone questioning my competence, but as a man genuinely seeking to learn from someone more successful. It was disconcerting, to be honest. Part of me had expected more resistance, more anger. Instead, I found a humiliated man confronting his own limitations and prejudices in a way I hadn't anticipated. The conversation that changed everything took place on a Sunday in December, 4 months after the revelation. Robert called me in for a private conversation in his old office, now technically my office. "Omari," he began, his words carefully measured. "I need to apologize to you." I waited, knowing that anything I said would interrupt a moment he had clearly rehearsed. "Not just for the things I said or did," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "but for who I allowed myself to be. You held up a mirror I didn't want to look into. And what I saw was a man who wasted 5 years getting to know someone extraordinary because he was blinded by racism," I finished calmly. "You can say the word, Robert. Recognizing the problem is the first step to fixing it." He swallowed hard and nodded. "Because of racism. I thought I was being protective of Jennifer, but I was actually being ignorant and cruel to you. And the irony is that you were exactly the kind of man I should have wanted for my daughter. Intelligent, successful, dedicated, loyal. But I was so focused on the color of your skin that I completely missed who you really were." It was at that moment that I felt something I didn't expect: compassion for Robert Whitman. Not pity, but the understanding that prejudice is, at its core, a form of ignorance that harms both those who practice it and those who suffer from it. "Robert," I finally said, "the apology is a start. But what are you going to do with that understanding?" His answer surprised me. "I want to learn. About investing, about business, about seeing people for who they really are, not for who I assume they are. I wasted 5 years of knowing my son-in-law. I don't want to waste the rest of my life being the same ignorant man." It was the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Robert became not only a respectful tenant, but a genuine student. He asked me questions about investment strategies, sought advice on financial decisions, and gradually began to show the kind of respect he should have shown from the start. More importantly, he began to use his experience as a retired politician to work with local civil rights organizations. Not as a performative penance, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding and correcting the systems he had unconsciously supported for decades. Jennifer and I went through couples therapy, working through the implications of 5 years of secrets about my true financial situation. It was a painful but necessary process. She had to confront her own perceptions about class, race, and money. I had to confront whether it had been fair to keep such significant secrets, even with good intentions. In the end, we decided that our relationship was strong enough to survive the truth, but that we would need to build a new version of ourselves based on complete honesty. The moment that sealed our reconciliation came when Jennifer finally met my parents. They came from Chicago for Christmas, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel the need to downplay who they were or where we came from. My father, a retired Boeing engineer who had invested wisely for decades, talked to Robert about commercial property development. My mother, a former school principal who had managed multimillion-dollar budgets, exchanged stories with Jennifer about financial management. It was when Jennifer saw my parents as complex, successful people, not as Omari's family, that she finally understood the systemic prejudice I had faced in her family. "They're amazing," she told me that night. "And I finally understand why you were frustrated when Dad questioned your abilities. He was questioning not just you, but your entire family, your entire upbringing." Today, 2 years after that revelation, our family dynamic is completely different. Robert and I have monthly meetings to discuss investments and local politics. He has become a vocal advocate for fairer housing policies in the region, using his personal experience of nearly losing his home to understand the needs of other families in similar situations. Jennifer began working as a financial advisor specializing in helping families restructure debt, applying lessons she learned from watching her own father's transformation. And me? I discovered that the most satisfying revenge was not humiliating Robert Whitman, but transforming him. Seeing a 67-year-old man recognize and correct deeply ingrained prejudices was more rewarding than any retaliation I could have imagined. The house where it all began now hosts Sunday dinners where we talk openly about race, money, and privilege. Conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable, but always honest. Robert still pays rent, but now it is rent that reflects a respectful partnership, not a one-sided power dynamic. Recently, he made me a proposal, to use his political experience and my financial resources to create a mentoring program for young lawyers from ethnic minorities. I want to help ensure that other talented young professionals don't have to hide who they are to be accepted, he said. It was at that moment that I knew the transformation was genuine and permanent. The lesson I learned was not about revenge or retaliation, but about the power of strategic patience and education through natural consequences. Robert Whitman didn't need to be destroyed, he needed to be educated. And sometimes, the most effective form of education is to allow people to face the direct consequences of their choices and prejudices. Today, when I look back, I don't see a story of revenge, but a story of mutual transformation. Robert learned to see beyond skin color. Jennifer learned about the prejudices she had normalized. And I learned that sometimes the most complete victory is not defeating your opponent, but turning them into an ally. If this journey of patience, strategy, and transformation has touched you, subscribe to the channel and share your own experience with family prejudice in the comments. Together, we can continue to build bridges where once there were only walls. The last time I saw Robert wearing his political tie was at a public hearing where he passionately advocated for more inclusive housing policies. When I recognized him on television, I smiled, realizing that the man who once called me a black intruder was now using his voice and influence to ensure that others did not face the same exclusion. Sometimes the most poetic justice is not the fall of the oppressor, but their transformation into a defender of those they once oppressed.